Main Event Maniacs, presented by the Juice Box.
The main event can make or break a show. It doesn't matter how good the undercard is, if the main event's a stinker, the entire event can be tainted.
Here on Main Event Maniacs, we revisit some of the most memorable main events in sports entertainment history, good and bad, across various promotions and eras of professional wrestling. I'm Jay, and happy to be joined by the Wolfpack and my black and white good friend and co-host, Brian.
Thanks, Jay. I am looking forward to this topic tonight because so much crap happened after this thing, and
Yes.
this was really, I think, the start of the downfall of WCW. Many people will point to what happened 2 weeks later, but I think this was the decision that really capped the crap that was going to happen over the next several years.
It was. We are revisiting the night the streak ended, of course, as Bill Goldberg defends and loses his WCW title to Kevin Nash at Starrcade 1998. Now, Brian, in 1998, I'm about to graduate from college. I'm not that far away, but I've got friends. Wrestling craze has taken over all the friends, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm in a rock and roll band at the time, and one of the guys in the band is a little bit older. He's married. He's got a house. And he says, look, everybody's throwing in a few bucks. We're going to get the pay-per-view. We're going to order some pizza, and we're all going to sit around the living room. We're going to watch this thing because it's during the holiday break. Yes, I'm in. So there's maybe, 15 of us in this room, in this living room, in Patrick's living room, all watching this thing go down, dude. And the collective gasp that came out in the room when it ended, and then the 2 hours afterward, we're sitting there talking about it and breaking it down. I still remember it like it was yesterday, man.
Yeah, and you'll probably hear me talk about this many times over the series of episodes that we do, but one of the things that we did, I was in college at this time. I would have been my second freshman year, we'll call it. Well, we'll say the first year was a red shirt.
Fair.
My second freshman year of college, and what we did, I went to a school where I was close to home, so we'd go home every weekend. And I was dating my soon-to-be wife at the time, and her family and my family are longtime friends, so we would actually get together as a big group on WCW pay-per-views, and we'd buy the pay-per-view. We'd have like pizza cook-offs, my dad versus her dad, and all this kind of stuff, and we just made it a big event every month or two, depending on the show. We'd almost always get all of them, but yeah, it was a good time, and I remember this very well. And again, we had my brother-in-law, who's about 9 years younger than my wife and I. He was a little kid, big Goldberg fan, and so his heart got crushed after this one. But it was a very memorable event, I'll say that.
It was, and at this point in the Monday Night Wars, I was firmly in Camp WCW.
Yes.
And it wasn't because I was a big Goldberg mark, but there are things that happened in this show that we'll talk about, briefly. And then, of course, the things that happened in the aftermath that ended that for me and a lot of other people. But at this point, I was like, they have lost the plot. Like, it's, there's a lot to get into with this, Brian. But I do think we need to get into our usual build-up, though, because there's a good bit of backstory leading into this.
Yeah, so let's begin. Bill Goldberg has been on an unprecedented rise to the main event of WCW after an inflated streak that would ultimately reach 173-0 going into our match. He electrified the crowds on his way to defeating Raven for the United States Championship on April 20th of 1998. Goldberg would continue to defend his title against the likes of Perry Saturn, Conan, and Kurt Hennig. As WCW then eyed a massive homecoming show in Atlanta, they looked at what they wanted for the main event of that show. WCW champion Hulk Hogan claims that he came up with the idea of putting Goldberg over clean at the event and then take back the belt somewhere else down the road. Well, on July 8, 1998, in front of 40,000 fans at the Georgia Dome, Hogan did just that, and Goldberg became the WCW heavyweight champion on a Monday Nitro. Let's not
on free
on a Monday
TV.
Nitro.
Yeah,
that was crazy.
Brian, I remember watching that Nitro because we knew what the main event was going to be. We'd watch Goldberg just mowing through people, and they made him do the gauntlet. Like, no, you got to defend the title against Scott Hall first, and then you get Hogan, but only if you beat Hall. So we're all like, well, obviously Hall's going down. So we watched that. We're building up, And then we get to that main event, and I'll never forget. It's one of my favorite Tony Schiavone calls either. When he jackhammers Hogan and 3 counts going down, he's like, "Oh hell yeah!" As only Tony can say, because everybody was like, "Yes, the end of the Hollywood Hogan era has come upon us finally." But oh, did we know so little about what was going on?
There's never an end to the Hogan era.
I love how you say that, like, Hogan claims it's his idea. I think Hogan has claimed every idea at some point.
Exactly.
It was probably Eric Bischoff's idea, truthfully, but because Bill Goldberg would tell you to this day, he's like, "Man, I don't know. I just did what they told me to do." Like, he didn't care. But he was. It is hard to put into words how friggin' over that guy had gotten for basically being a somewhat slower version of the Ultimate Warrior. I mean, like, he was the only guy that rose up during that time, besides the cruiserweights that would go on to be great elsewhere. They weren't doing anything here. And he was the guy that broke through, and people just responded to him because he was this monster that walked to the ring. He Hulk smashed everything, and he got the hell out in 3 minutes. And it was a lot of fun,
Yeah, and he didn't talk. He rarely said a word. And in fact, when he finally ushered his big phrase, "Who's next?" or "You're next," and all that, like, that was what people were fired up. This was different. Like, he was going in there and he was squashing guys. And that just, he did some jobbers at first, but these were the jobbers in a sense that they weren't like big time guys, and they weren't jobbers. Like, you look at Hugh Morris, the first guy he beat on television. That was a big upset because Hugh Morris was on TV every week, and this guy nobody had ever seen before. And he comes out there and he just destroys Hugh Morris. That was a huge deal. Even Larry Zbyszko on the call was like, "I can't believe this, Who is this Goldberg guy who just beat Hugh Morris, And so that was his claim to fame, and he rose and rose and rose, and people were way behind him. Then he started getting matches with big time people, right? Bigger, upper mid card, I'd say, people. And the big one was Raven. And when he finally defeated Raven for that U.S. title, that was like, okay, we got something here, right? This is not just a flash in the pan guy. And so moving forward. Now, Hulk Hogan, he claims all this stuff. Now, Hogan was always a big fan of Goldberg, but I have a hard time believing that he's like, I want to put Goldberg over clean, because he didn't want to put anyone over clean.
I was going to say, when did that ever happen?
Like, the only time that happened before was Lex Luger, when Lex Luger beat him with the torture rack in fair and square, and that was a huge deal. And then, of course, Hogan won it back 3 days later.
Right.
Didn't really mean much, but
the other thing WCW was smart to capitalize on was this idea, and it really came from the fans again, of this streak. People started holding up signs. Like, 15-0, and they're like, well, shit, let's just start making this stuff up, man. And like, I love that they built, but that is a thing that people can get on board with when it's a babyface run. Is like, this, can anybody stop this guy? It's like the football team that never seems to lose a game, and it's like, when are they going to finally lose? When are they ever going to lose?
It's like Connecticut women's basketball, right?
Exactly, Connecticut women's basketball. They
never lost a game, and when it finally happened, people was like, whoa.
It's wild. Or when, that Patriots team, they couldn't lose, and then they finally did in the Super Bowl, and it was like, wow, that 17-0 run ended with that last loss. But I think people like to root for a streak when it's building. And then at some point they get on the other side of it, and we can talk about whether or not that has happened yet. But the idea of having the streak and building it up as a thing was a smart gimmick.
Well, I mean, and I will tell you that it did happen, but it wasn't Bill Goldberg's fault. It was the really bad booking of WCW after this, because he won't go on. Like, he wins this title and he defends it against, I can't remember who it is, but he defends it against someone at the next pay-per-view, and then doesn't wrestle on a pay-per-view until Halloween Havoc against DDP.
Yeah.
Like, this is July, right? That's like a, 4-month span of not really participating. He wasn't at Fall Brawl. He wasn't at Road Wild. I mean, he did an appearance and did some sort of NWO gauntlet thing, but it wasn't a high-profile match. Like, he was undercard to Hogan and Rodman and all that crap that was going on at the time.
Exactly, yeah. The NWO was still the attraction, or was going to be put in the main events, in spite of the fact that they didn't currently hold the world title.
Yeah. All right, let's see what's going on the other side with Kevin Nash. So meanwhile, in the NWO, they're splintering, right? And by May, they had split into 2 different factions. The NWO Hollywood, led by Hulk Hogan, and the NWO Wolfpack, led by Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Randy Savage. Shortly after, Hall would then turn on Kevin Nash and join NWO Hollywood, and Sting, of all people, would join the NWO Wolfpack. So
Everybody was joining the NWO, man.
Right there, you know, the Wolfpack are the over ones with the fans, and the Hollywood are the bad guys. You know, right? We know right there. Hall and Nash would feud through the summer and into the fall, culminating in a match at Halloween Havoc. After a constant switching of members, like they moved over and over constantly. Like one guy would turn on this guy, and the next guy would turn on this guy, and then you had these tag team champions in Sting and the Giant. Then the Giant turns on Sting and joins Hollywood, and Sting joins the Wolfpack, and it's like, what the hell?
And then you got Disco Inferno trying to join both of them at one time or another. Yeah, it's
exactly.
insane. Yeah.
Oh, it's just crazy. So they have a plethora of switching of members over and over again in a short period of time. But Kevin Nash would go on to win the World War III three-ring battle royal, a concept that is interesting when done right, but it can get really confusing. And the one thing I hated about those shows is that they had the three rings up all night, and so like the matches would take place and it'd start in this ring and then it'd go over this ring and that ring and this ring and that ring, and it'd be like, okay, this is annoying. But the three-ring battle royal is a neat concept. They just didn't pull it off great every time. But when they did it right, it was good. Like you had your winner of this ring, and this ring, then they were the three that would fight each other. That was good. When it was just like everyone against everyone, it was kind of like blah. But anyway, Kevin Nash goes on to win the three-ring battle royal, and he earns his shot at Goldberg's championship. Now you got to remember, at this time, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had now broken up for like the 700th time in 2 months, and going into this, it was Kevin Nash and Wolfpack and Scott Hall and NWO Hollywood. So that's kind of our build-up right now for this match.
Yeah, and you know, Nash at the time was the booker with a lot of other involvement.
He was on the booking team.
Yeah,
and it was recently that he was installed there.
Yeah, but he could work a mic. He had a real way with it. He was a good mouthpiece. And I remember when he got out on that Nitro and said, "Like it or not, I'm next." And everybody was like, what? You know, because it was, I mean, you knew it, but to hear him say it was a thing. And then him and Goldberg would point fingers at each other and do all this. And you're like, these guys are going to explode when they hit each other. And looking back on it now, I laugh and go like, the two slowest dudes in the company are, but they're building it up like they're supposed to do. And so it was a huge build up to, I mean, let's face it, Starrcade is WCW, NWA's like, that's their free, that and the Great American Bash are like their big pay-per-views. Starrcade ending the year, always a big deal. They try to put on a mass show, and they were going to try to do that with this one too.
Absolutely. And we remember at this time as well, Hulk Hogan had kind of semi-retired.
Yeah,
he was running for president of the United States.
Yeah, like Jay Leno and all that crap.
Really weird stuff going on with that whole storyline. And Kevin Nash will be the first to say that it was not his idea to beat Goldberg. He was kind of coerced into doing it. His idea it wasn't the right time, and I agree with him. It probably wasn't the right time, and we'll get into that later. But even still, it wasn't a good look for them, because you got to remember, in 1998, the dirt sheets were full force on the internet now. Everyone could go to the internet and find all sorts of backstage news. It was brand new, right around 96, 97, when that stuff started really taking off. You had the Prodigy forums with Eric Bischoff. That was kind of a big deal. You had WCW Live on the internet that was going on. So the dirt sheets were a big deal. So this news wasn't like hidden. Like people knew Kevin Nash was on this booking committee. So it was a bad look in that sense that they had put Kevin Nash in this match. But whatever, it is what it is.
So they're going to try to stage this huge Starrcade, right? Which means we're going to have this murderous killer card. Well, let's get into that for a little bit, my friend, as we set the scene. December the 27th, 1998, Washington, D.C. The MCI Center, now known as the Capital One Arena, home of the NCAA basketball Georgetown Hoyas, the Washington Wizards of the NWA, and the Washington Capitals of the NHL. DC was an area NWA and WCW ran a lot back in those days, and not the WWF, WWE didn't, but NWA, WCW ran a lot in those days.
Which is interesting, because Capital Wrestling, that was their home, was Washington, D.C. That's where Vince McMahon Sr. built WWF. So the fact that it was now a WCW territory and not a WWF territory was rather interesting.
That Mid-Atlantic reach, man, you know, like Flair and those guys had really built that, and the Crockett's and all that. So this was an area that was good. It's home of a lot of WCW pay-per-views, including the infamous 1990 Capital Comeback featuring friggin' RoboCop. So if you remember that. Not the first time they would do that, but maybe another day we'll get into that. Announced attendance about 16,066, which is pretty good. Pay-per-view buys 423,000 homes, my friend. That's a heck of a buy rate.
That's a big buy rate.
That is a major buy rate, yeah.
And Starrcade was, in all intents and purposes, WCW's biggest drawing card.
It was their Mania. Yeah, it was their WrestleMania.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so they're used to pulling close to 1 million buys on a Starrcade. This number is actually pretty low for a Starrcade.
Yeah, it tells you how divided the wrestling world was getting at this point. With people going WWE, people going WCW at this point. We were really drawing the lines, but it's still a good buy, you know, at the time. We got Tony Schiavone, Mike Tenay, and Bobby Heenan on the call. I've always found it interesting when they would do that because it's like you got two play-by-play guys and the color guy, the heel color guy, but also Bobby at that point was playing a lot of face.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because they had this thing about 3-man commentary teams, right?
Yeah.
And it was also weird because at Nitro you'd have one commentary team for the first hour and another commentary team for the second hour, and then they kind of mixed those up at pay-per-view time.
Yeah, everybody was doing this though. The NFL was trying to do that on Monday night still, you know, and they were throwing like, you know, Rush Limbaugh and Dennis Miller in there and all that crap. You remember like everybody was experimenting with the 3-man weave, and it just sometimes worked better than not. But we still got Mean Gene handling the interviews, obviously, doing a lot of fun stuff. And, you know, as we'll get into, some of the other usual suspects make the appearance.
Mm-hmm.
All told, we got 9 matches on the card, Brian. Now, one of them is impromptu. We'll talk about that in a sec. Some paying off some food, some setting up some more, and some flat out wasting some time. I'm not gonna lie, we were having a lot of other things going on in the living room during a lot of this because we were waiting for the big one. But in the undercard, we got Billy Kidman in a 3-way dance with Rey Mysterio Jr. and Juventud Guerrero for the cruiserweight belt, and it's a good match. They do all the cruiserweight things, but Eddie Guerrero, of course, gets involved at the end, and then he and Kidman decide to go toe to toe for another 10 minutes. So the first 30 minutes of this pay-per-view are cruiserweights, like flippity flopping and all over the ring, man. Billy comes out on top with the strap. It's fun, but I'm like, man, we just burned like almost 45 minutes on one thing to start this. It was a sign of things to come, or at least it should have been. We got Norman Smiley over Prince Ikea, snooze. Perry Saturn took out Ernest at Cat Miller, remember him?
Unfortunately.
Brian Adams, not the singer, and Scott Norton with Vincent beat Finlay and Jerry Flynn in a tag match for no reason. Conan retained the WCW television title over Chris Jericho, which was a big deal at the time because Jericho was pretty over, but he and Conan were having a good back and forth. And then you get Eric Bischoff and Ric Flair in what can loosely be called a match. It's supposed to be like for the presidency of the company or control or retire, loser leave town. I don't know. There's a lot of stipulations. Eric won after an assist from Kurt Hennig and, you know, some, I think they're brass knuckles. I don't know. It's pretty bad. Like if you've seen it, it's horrendous. Probably the match of the night, honestly, was the right before the main event, which is weird because usually you do the throwaway before the main event, right? DDP and the Giant put on a hell of a match, man, and it's got a killer finish to it. If you haven't seen that one, recommend go check it out, folks. Deserved a little bit more than what it got because those guys really put on a show before we get into the main event.
DDP delivered more than anyone on the WCW roster. The month before this, he and Goldberg had Goldberg's greatest match, I think, in WCW history.
I agree.
Was him and DDP. And it was also Goldberg's longest match to date. I think it went some 20-some minutes.
Yeah.
And just absolutely fantastic. So DDP, he could work with a broom, it seems like, when it comes to matches. And he did wonderful things. So, yeah.
What's wild is DDP is in his mid-40s at this point. He is a lot older than all these guys.
Which, back then, was...
That was old.
Common, right? That was old.
Yeah.
Now people are in their 40s and 50s and wrestling like they were in their 20s. But back then, someone in their mid 40s, that was considered retirement age for wrestlers. For most
and I mean,
wrestlers.
yeah, and he got a late start, but he has made the most of it. And
Absolutely.
But yeah, he and Giant, they put on a hell of a show. It's a great finish because Giant's going to super choke slam him off the top rope, and DDP flips it into the diamond cutter, which I'm like, eat your heart out, Randy Orton, with your RKOs. I don't know. DDP was doing that shit long before you were doing anything. But yeah, I love that. It was great. And then that leads us to the main event. And look, Nash was a formidable opponent for Goldberg because one, he hadn't had a lot of opponents. But Nash is 7 feet tall. He's a wrecking machine himself. I mean, the Diesel, we've seen him do some work, and he's maybe on the other side of his, his great days in his career, but he can still work. He can do stuff. And I know your favorite thing, though, is the fact that they got Michael Buffer to do the intros, and they didn't bother to feed him the right line about the streak. So he announces the wrong number as both guys are taking their time to get to the ring. And Mickey J, of course, is our referee in a no DQ match. They've made that point a lot. But real quick, though, we haven't talked about him before. Your thoughts on Michael Buffer, Brian?
Can't stand him. I mean, if he wasn't on every single WCW pay-per-view for the main event, I probably wouldn't mind so much. But it got so old, the whole Let's Get Ready to Rumble thing. They should have brought him out only like once or twice a year. Then it would be tolerable and it'd be kind of a cool thing. But they brought him for every pay-per-view, every month. He was there for the main event and it did the same shtick. And it was just like, I can live without that. And so even as I was rewatching this, I literally left the room when they were doing the intros because I didn't want to hear it. I don't like listening to him. It's like, blah.
Well, it goes on for a while. Nash takes his sweet time getting to the ring with his big sexy music, and Buffer does his thing. And then, of course, Goldberg's famous, blow up on the way to the ring is happening as he comes out. It's not as far a walk as I've seen him do, but it's still pretty well deep into the recesses of the MCI. And then he comes out through the smoke and the fireworks and the snarling and all that. And we get the big intro, and like I say, Buffer screws up the streak, which Shivani's trying to cover, which is wild. But they make a big deal out of it's going to be a no DQ match, and when I hear that, watching it back, and I even remember then, I'm like, oh man, what, who's getting involved? Somebody, somebody was going to get involved from the outside. There was going to be stuff.
Well, you knew that was coming, but what really was interesting is they rarely use the no DQ clause in this. And in fact, when Nash was caught in a leg hold and got to the ropes, like Goldberg didn't have to get rid of that. He could have kept holding that, but the referee counted him on 5 anyway. It's like,
and the one time they use it in the thing, which was always a slick, is when Nash low blows him. We'll get into that.
That was like really the only time until the end where they used the stipulation. Like there were no weapons, there were no cheap shots. Now Goldberg was using closed fists on Nash at one point, which in technical terms is illegal. But other than that, they really never played it up until that low blow in the end.
So let's get into it. I mean, this match is supposed to be 11 minutes long, but it's actually about 7 minutes of actual movement. Because as with most guys that have, I don't want to say limited, Brian, how do I want to say this? The guys who have a defined move set and a defined way to work, you can do one of two things. And we were beyond the days of let's do tests of strength for 10 minutes. We're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to grip and flex and all that crap. So they got to run into each other a couple times. They got to kind of dodge each other, get in and out of the ring, and then they finally start going at each other. And when they do, I'll give these guys credit. They really go at each other pretty hard. It's some hard smacks going on. They're laying it in pretty thick.
And not only that, they actually do some interesting submission moves, and Goldberg uses some fancy suplexes and all this stuff. Like they've actually tried to wrestle a match, which is interesting.
He gets his spear quick too.
Oh yeah.
It's like a big like, oh, he's going for it quick,
Yes, and it looked like it was going to be over fast, which probably would have popped the fans if it was that way, but it ends up not being that way. Yeah. What really was bugging me, though, is like Kevin Nash was trying to do some good psychology in this match by working over Bill Goldberg's back and all this other stuff to make it, psychologically feel like Goldberg wouldn't be able to lift him up for the jackhammer, which I don't think he ever actually tried to do in this match.
He tried to get him once, and that's when he got the low blow because after that spear move. But you're right, and Nash had a great he would throw you in the corner, and you would come out, and he would get you in the sidewalk slam, and he was so big, he could hold you there forever, and then he just drove you through the friggin' mat. I mean, it's a vicious-looking move.
Plus, there were multiple times where he threw him into the rope and then just nailed him in the back. And it was like, yeah, this is smart psychological wrestling. He's trying to wear down the back so that Goldberg can't hit him with his move. But then Goldberg just doesn't really work it into the match. He suddenly is like lifting him up with suplexes, and if he actually like went with the bad back thing, like, it's like, he could have done so much there with the psychology of this match to make it better. But Goldberg just kind of tosses it out the window like it didn't matter.
He had not figured out how to really sell damage at that point.
No, he just shakes his head.
Yeah, and
shake it off.
Yeah, and it was like, well, I mean, like that's part of it, but at some point you like, it's more interesting for the hero to take damage, and you feel like they're really in trouble in one of these things. Because I mean, at this point, Goldberg hadn't really been in trouble with anybody except DDP. Like that was the only guy that had really put even the Hogan match.
Sting,
even those guys, like he just threw them around like ragdolls, And when he took out Hogan, it was like you wanted him to just to friggin' destroy him, and he pretty much does. And to watch him take the punishment he takes from Nash, he should have been playing it better. Like I agree, it would have sold more into the match, and they could have got more out of it before they get to this schmozzy finish that they're gonna do here. So let's talk about it though, because really the finish of this is the thing everybody knows. Goldberg is getting ready to line up, and who comes to the ring but the friggin' Disco Inferno, who's trying to like join. He's been trying to join a lot of things, but he's really trying to join the Wolfpack. So he's got on like a red shirt, but it's not an official shirt.
Right.
And of course Goldberg just squashes him because Glenn Gilberti will take heat and doesn't care. So he just crushes him. But it's like, of all the guys to do the run-in, like, the next one makes sense. But that one was an odd start. I know what they're building up to, but I'm like, Disco? Really? Like, we don't have anybody else?
I liked it because if you were watching the TV at the time and Disco kept trying to, be with the Wolfpack, and they kept denying him. And it was just great. So having him come down there to try and help Nash win the match, I think was kind of funny. I got a kick out of it, especially when it first aired. And then, of course, you have, what was it, Bam Bam then comes down, and he attacks. And then, of course, the infamous Scott Hall, who, by the way, wasn't in the NWO Wolfpack yet. He was NWO Hollywood.
Wearing an event staff t-shirt or whatever with the faux cattle prod.
Oh, man.
I mean, so we should say, like, Nash is hurting at this point because Goldberg has whooped the hell out of him. He's clotheslined Bam Bam out. He's blown up Disco, and he's getting in the corner, and he's getting ready to do the spear. The big spear. And he just turns around long enough to see this guy, and you know who it is because Scott Hall's got that friggin' ponytail going. You immediately know, and he's also got the toothpick. And then he cattle prods him or whatever, and Goldberg does the funniest sell of getting electrocuted I've ever seen in my life. I remember distinctly everybody there like laughing because we didn't think that was going to be it. Like we didn't know what was coming. It's hilarious to watch him like writhe around right now, man.
The best part of the whole thing is as Goldberg's sitting there, you hear the cattle prod go off like Scott Hall's testing it, and Goldberg then turns, he's like, huh?
Yeah, I'm like, he gets triggered it early. It's like everything, and then again, is the typifying point of like everything that's wrong with WCW is happening right now. It's all a step out of place. It's all like we got the number wrong. We got this going on. We got this too much of this crap going on. Now we gotta have an extra cruiserweight match. We got all this crap going on, and none of it seems to be organized at all. Yeah. And that's the thing, is it looks disorganized, and that's bad because what happens next is pretty great. Kevin Nash picks Goldberg up, and it's one of the hardest jackknives ever. And give it to him.
He lets him go.
Him and Goldberg, he drops him, and Goldberg realizes, like, oh shit, he just let me go. And he flat backs himself because he knows he's about to take it on the neck. And he makes a good splat out of it. And the way Kevin Nash bounces off the rope and on top of him, like he almost splashes him to get the pin, and that was when we all went, what? And you can hear the crowd go like, what? Like they couldn't believe it happened.
And then they popped huge.
Yeah, that was a huge pop. That was, it was a
they've been
massive
back and
pop.
forth in this one, right?
Yeah.
You had a Goldberg sucks chant going on in the crowd at one point in the night. But you had cheers for both men. Pretty loud cheers for both men.
You got people dressed up in the Nash gear.
Yeah, and they popped huge for that victory. But my favorite part is as Nash is covering Goldberg, and every time the referee's hand hits, Goldberg shakes himself.
Yes, he's like still like
effect.
twitching from the electrocution. Like it's like they told him like when you get hit with it, man, you gotta act like you're like electrocuted for like several minutes. And his only reaction to that was like, I guess I'll just like writhe around like a fish.
Yeah,
it's what he
hilarious.
does. It is, and even like he keeps selling it afterward. Like he's trying to get out of the ring, and he's still like twitching.
And Nash is trying to sell that he's confused as to what happened to Bill, and Goldberg just flops out of the ring. It's like, okay,
because he doesn't know at that point, right?
My favorite part, and this is typical WCW, is they during the replay sequence they show Scott Hall leaving, and he pulls up the heavily taped with the electric tape cattle prod.
Yes, he shows
and hits
the prop.
button. It's like, come
Clicks
on,
again.
man.
And what he should have done was turn around when Nash is winning and he's standing in the ring and he's kind of gathering himself. He should turn around and see, Scott Hall standing there, and Hall should just do like one of these little like "I got you" and just kind of point at him and walk away, because then you leave intrigue. It's like,
exactly,
what's going on? How did this happen? But it's hilarious. It is, and I'll give it. Shivani and Tenay and Bobby do a great job of putting this over as much as they can. Tony really sells the shock, for everybody. The streak is over 173-1. Like they make a big deal out of that, and they go off at that point. And again, you're left with like, what's gonna happen? How did it go? And before we get to the aftermath, though, we talked a little bit about it. Would you book it any different? Like, would you?
Oh, yes.
Tell me how you would. I would love to hear that.
Goldberg would not lose this match. That's the first thing. This was way too soon. We're talking, July to December. That's 5
months.
5 months?
5 months.
5 months reign. 175 days, if I'm not mistaken, was his title reign. And, that's a long time in today's days, but back then, when you had Hogan reigning for 800 years in WCW, on and off with a 2-day break or here and there, it just seemed like the momentum wasn't quite there yet. Now, I understand that there were some fans that were turning on him at the time, but that was a result of the terrible booking.
Yeah.
You had plenty of matches left for Bill Goldberg to get through to hold on to that title before. And the best thing they could have done was to have a rematch with Hogan and have Hogan win it that way, right? Because that would have been the payoff to a long feud, and then have Goldberg chase Hogan again, and then you could do that forever, right? But instead, they end it here, and Goldberg never again wins the WCW title.
No,
he never wins it back in the next however many three years that they're in existence, and 2 where he's a main player. He doesn't win it back. They try to get him back there a couple times, and of course he does stupid things and injures himself. But that was his last reign, and they dropped it so bad. So if I'm booking this, Nash doesn't win the title. He may win the match, but he doesn't win the title. It's got to be some flubbed ending.
So here's how I agree with you on this. I would do everything the same up until the very end. And I would have Scott Hall show up with that cattle prod, but instead of getting electrocuted with it, Goldberg grabs it, throws it away from him, knocks him out. Here comes Nash, and he intercepts him halfway through, spears him, jackhammers him, wins. And you're like, nope, you're gonna have to bring more than that to beat me, And then you can have some more fun with Nash and Hall, and have them continue their feud. That books that out. You've let Goldberg beat a real monster. So now maybe you get him Scott Hall, you give him some other things, like you said, leading up to something like Great American Bash where Hogan gets the belt back. Like you figure out a way to do that. I agree, it's too early at this point, and it's too cheesy because the thing is Nash had held his own with Goldberg the whole time. Yeah. And when his dumbass friends got involved is when he finally won, but it's almost like he didn't need it. It's and that would have been the other part is Nash should have been pissed about the way it went down. So that's let's talk about the aftermath, Brian, because he
does get pissed at Scott Hall, quote unquote.
Well, there may be no more emphasis on what happened next to any of these we talk about, dude. Goldberg and Nash are supposed to have a rematch in 2 weeks, not the next Nitro, but the first one of the year, January the 4th.
At the Georgia Dome again, by the way.
Yes, at the Georgia Dome. But Goldberg got, quote, arrested, in quote, in storyline for stalking Miss Elizabeth or some nonsense. So bad. And this storyline eventually led to Hogan is going to take his space against Nash. And what happened next is one of the most controversial booking decisions in the history of the WCW. The finger poke of doom, where Nash lays out for Hogan, and then the Black and White and the Wolfpack all celebrate the championship going back on Hogan as if this is this big-ass JFK conspiracy to get the belt back on Hulk Hogan.
And Hulk Hogan is now a member of the Wolfpack and leaves NWO Hollywood with a jobber team of unprecedented characters.
Yes. However they got there aside, the idea of trying to somewhat reunite the original NWO faction to get heat on Hogan again, I get that. Mission accomplished. But dude, to say people turned on this angle, the two things happened that night. One, the giving away of the WWF finishes was a thing that they were doing. And when they did the line about Mankind, that'll put the butts in this, all that stuff, we all know about that. That turned a lot of people off because people love Mick Foley. And a lot of people say, like, well, this was really the time when the cliff dropped. And people were like, nah, I'm done with this crap.
Well, here's the thing, right? If you want to put the belt back on Hogan, why do it this way? And why not have him be the one to beat Goldberg? You could have shenanigans up and down the line. You could have had this stupid cattle prod finish for a Hogan win instead. That put the belt on. But to have Kevin Nash be the one to defeat Goldberg, only to just hand the title over to Hulk Hogan 2 weeks later, made zero sense. No. Instead, they should have had Goldberg go over, have Hogan claim a rematch against him at the Atlanta Georgia Dome. It would have been perfect, circle around to the last match, and then have Hogan win with shenanigans there. But no, they did it this way.
The other thing is, and this is another, just goes without saying, you don't do this on free TV. Like that's I mean, again, they were giving it away like candy at this point, but this is a bad idea. Like, you got to save this.
Yeah, well, and this just goes to show, like, at this point in time, ratings were more important than buy rates.
Yep. A
year before this, Sting, Hogan, that sold over 1 million buys on pay-per-view. This was down over half of that buy. It's because you got to see these kind of events for free. Just the month before, the pay-per-view with DDP, or 2 months before, the pay-per-view with DDP and Goldberg, that got cut off the air, so they gave you that match for free on Nitro the next night.
Yeah.
Why not just refund the damn money?
And you're right about the other thing, the rise of the dirt sheet culture on the internet and stuff. You could find out what happened immediately. You didn't have to buy it anymore. Right. It became a thing that was like, it's going to be on free TV anyway. Just wait 10 minutes or wait to the internet and you can get on and watch it. And then what they do after is they just lose the plot completely. Goldberg feuds with Scott Hall and Bam Bam Bigelow over the next year. Completely forgettable. Hogan will lose the belt to Ric Flair in March of 1999 at the uncensored First Blood match before, quote, rehabbing an injury. And then eventually returning as a face, I guess, later that year. All that led to the uber infamous Bash at the Beach 2000, which is another main event for another day. But the sliding down the hill has begun, and then it really accelerated in January 1999.
It did. Goldberg didn't help himself here, like you said. You also had Vince Russo at this point. In 1999, in October of 1999, Vince Russo had left WWF and had joined WCW, and he took over as the lead booker. That changed everything. Bret Hart becomes your champion.
Started hot-shotting the title off of every day.
Goldberg comes in to wrestle Bret Hart at the Starrcade the next year, and they do the infamous screwjob finish on Goldberg, and really ridiculous. Then Goldberg, as he's getting ready to chase after the title, does something really stupid, and he goes to break a window in a limousine, and it doesn't break. So instead of using a jimmied device to help break it, he uses his own fist, puts it through the window, and slices an artery in his arm that puts him out of action for a long time.
Yep.
So they were actually booking it so that Goldberg would eventually get back the title, and then he goes and ruins that. Bret Hart's going to be out of action after this infamous match with Goldberg. Shortly after, he has the concussion that ends his career, basically. Everything falls apart. And Goldberg, like I said, Goldberg never regains this WCW title until he's in WWE, and it's now the World Heavyweight Championship. That was the next time he would hold that same title.
Yeah, exactly. It would take a company change for it to happen. And,
Crazy.
yeah, it is wild to think about. Like, it's such a monumental moment, the Goldberg rise, and then the abrupt way that it ends, man. It's like you find this band and they release 3 killer albums in a row, and you're like, holy cow! And then all of a sudden they just friggin' disappear, and and they're still putting out music separately, but you're like, but this all sucks. Like, why don't you get back together? And they never get back together. They never get it, and it's wild to think about that. Clearly, they didn't know what they had, and they didn't know how to do anything with it when they got it. They just knew how to like build it, and then things will happen. And again, this whole pay-per-view, and I encourage you folks, go watch and try to watch the whole thing. It's a lot.
It's bad.
Through. I watched it twice for this, by the way, just to make sure I caught it. And dude, I'm not gonna lie, that undercard, it was just as bad this time as it was in 1998 when I watched it. It's bad. The cruiserweights working hard aside, up until DDP the Giant, I'm like, everything in this is completely forgettable. And then DDP and the Giant put on a hell of a show. But yeah.
And I gotta say, WCW Starrcade, like we said, it was their big event every year. And ever since, oh gosh, you can go into I would say since the Bischoff era took over, the vast majority of the Starrcade cars have been awful.
Yeah, they wrecked
awful.
it.
Yeah. They had a huge main event that they went in with, and the undercard on, like we said, with WCW, the undercard always overperformed and the main event underperformed, except at Starrcade. At Starrcade in '97, that was an absolutely trash card with a huge main event. That card had matches that should have been good, but they weren't good. And then the main event was great until the end when it got ruined, and we'll talk about that coming up very soon. But even in this one, terrible undercard. In the next year's one, it was just another, just bad stuff. And with a main event that was overshadowed by the undercard semi-main event. The next year is going to be Jarrett and Chris Benoit.
Yeah.
For the United States Championship in a ladder match.
And put on a great show.
Amazing.
It's a great match. Yeah.
Amazing, right?
Yeah.
But the rest of the card was just like, ugh.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is it's like you're waiting. The setup is great. The idea is there. And then the execution, it's just so disorganized. And that's what I walk away from this just thinking of all these that we've talked about so far. This one feels like the most haphazardly put together. Like, it feels like it was concocted an hour before the show started, and I'm sure it wasn't. And they've retold the story about it so many times now. Whoever will know the truth. I tend to believe Bill Goldberg's versions of things because he really doesn't care. Like, he doesn't have any vanity about any of this stuff, and he's just like, was it the time? I don't know. It ain't my call. They just told me what was going down before the show. And when he says that, I believe they told him hey, Bill, by the way, this is how this is going to go. So just act like you're electrocuted. Okay. And I don't think he expected Kevin to drop him from 9 feet in the air. That he did look surprised when that happened, because usually Kevin will help you on the jackknife.
Oh, yeah.
And for whatever reason, he's like, this dude's heavy, or I don't like him, or whatever, but F it, I'm dropping him. And good on Bill for knowing how to land, because that could have ended badly. But it's one of the weirdest jackknives I've seen. I'm like, you just let him go, bro. Like, that's really wild.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember, he almost decapitated the Giant earlier that year with the same move.
This is true.
So,
yeah. It not known for their safety were the WCW pay-per-views, but we're here at Final Bell, man. As we talk about this stuff, we talked about how we would rebook it, and I think we're both on to different ways of doing it. I come down on this thinking maybe it was the time, maybe it wasn't. There was a way to do this and make it work and keep this going and keep the momentum happening. And it's like they pick the absolute antithesis of that at every turn here and going forward. It just screwed it all up. And it's wild to watch. It's in some ways it's kind of fun to watch because it's always fun to watch, grand failure happen in front of you. Like you see these, grandiose ideas, and it's like Spider-Man, Turn Off the Dark, the Broadway show. Like, yeah, it was a disaster, but you had to see it, And it's like a bad movie, The Room or something. And this feels very much like that era of WCW. It's like you had to see it fall apart because it was spectacular.
Yeah, it really was. It just remember the frustration back in the day with this whole thing. That Goldberg was their star, and they just screwed it. They screwed the pooch.
Yeah.
With this match, with everything to follow, it was almost like even Vince Russo, who Goldberg has vehemently said he does not care for very well. Right?
Does anybody like Vince besides like Disco Inferno?
Yeah, like Jeff Jarrett.
Jeff. True, Jeff does. Yeah.
I mean, Vince Russo tried to really do some good stuff with him and Goldberg and Bret Hart. Like, they had a really good story going into that, where Bret Hart would always offer Bill Goldberg matches. They had the tag team titles together. They were, Bret offered a shot to Bill Goldberg at the title, and then he got screwed out of that one. And Bret was like, I didn't mean for that to happen. This is crap, And they did a good story up to that, and then they screwed the pooch on that finish at Starrcade the next year too. It was just like, they didn't know how to bring him back into the storyline and use him. And I don't know if it was politics, because like you said, Goldberg didn't care. He did whatever they wanted him to, and just went with it. Was it politics that caused it to happen that way? Was it something else? I just don't know. But they just never found a way to recapture the glory of Bill Goldberg. In fact, WWF did it better than they did when Goldberg moved into WWE at the time, when he moved over there.
Yeah, they knew what to do with him. Yeah, they really did. And you're right, Goldberg, in a lot of ways, would be the perfect guy to work with because he'll do whatever you tell him to do. Like, he's like, okay, sure, yeah, I can do that. And there's a way to book him and make it work. And even when he had like the later day run, like a few years ago and stuff, they booked that pretty good. Like, they knew when it was time to knock it off of him, and when it was time to let him keep it. And it's a grand example of mismanagement. And we talk about in the intro of the show every time, like, the whole card can suck, but if the main event can you go, then it'll save it. Or if the main event's bad, it sinks the whole card. And in this case, the whole card sucks,
except for one match.
That one match that is buried, because again, you don't do that match before the main event because it upstaged the main event big time. At least in WrestleMania 3, everybody always says like Steamboat Savage is like the match to watch, right? Besides the Hogan Andre being such a big deal, but they were smart enough to know put that one in the middle of the show, because they knew you can't put that before the big main event, and WCW didn't figure that out. So that's where we are. Well, of course, folks, it's always fun revisiting these things here. You can find this show on this very feed, the Juice Box. From time to time, feel free to connect with Juice Springsteen. Follow Juice on Twitter X at JuicySteen, on Instagram at Juicy Wrestling Closet. You can subscribe now on YouTube as well at Juicy Steen. And of course, this podcast is available everywhere you can find podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music. And if you have the time, do swing by, leave a rating and review. We always thank you for the support.
And if you want to follow myself or Jay, you can do that on X by going at Jay Ran Here, or me at Brian Thomas 878.
Yep, and that's how you can keep up with us. And we'll be back again for another episode of Main Event Maniacs very, very soon. So once again, shout out to our buddy Juice. Thanks for letting us have this avenue to do this. For Brian, I'm Jay. This has been your Main Event.
That was The Juice Box with Juice Springsteen. Make sure to subscribe to The Juice Box wherever you listen to podcasts.